In this video, we dive into the chilling case of a woman who vanished without a trace after sending a series of strange, unsettling messages. In an attempt to make sense of a complex web of contradictions, police immediately jumped on the investigation. However, even the most experienced investigators could not have predicted the direction of this inquiry. What started out as a case involving a missing person quickly turned into a national scandal. Let's get into today's case. In 1983, Katie Kenyon was born in Burnley, a tiny British town. The three of them were quite close, and she had two sisters, one younger and one older. Katie was notable for her charity and kindness, even as a young child. She was the kind of person who would sacrifice everything to assist a stranger. She later married and had two children, a girl and a son. However, her spouse finally abandoned the family. After that, Katie was parenting the children alone, which wasn't easy, but he continued to see them occasionally. Her salary as a social worker was insufficient to cover her basic expenses. Nevertheless, Katie made every effort to ensure her kids had everything they needed, regardless of how difficult things grew. Katie, 33, went about her daily business on the morning of April 2nd, 2022, getting her children ready and sending them off to school. However, a few hours later at noon, she sent her mom a text that seemed completely strange. Katie mentioned she would be gone for a bit since she needed some time to get her thoughts straight. The worry really began to set in when her mother tried to contact immediately, but the call went straight to voicemail. She was aware that Katie had battled anxiety for years, primarily as a result of her life's stress. However, the notion that she would simply abandon everything, particularly her children, simply did not make sense. Katie's mother contacted her sisters, but none of them took the message seriously either. They saw that her automobile was missing when they hurried to her residence. They entered with the spare key and discovered everything Katie had left behind, with the exception of her phone and purse. It simply didn't make sense. It felt so awful to think that Katie had left practically everything behind and gone somewhere. There was a problem. When Katie's children returned home from school a little while later, they also had something to say. Their mother had sent them both odd messages. In the text, she requested them to get in touch with their father so he could take care of them while she was away, and stated that she needed help to become a better mother. Upon reading the texts, Katie's mother and sisters began to seriously question whether she was the author. To begin with, the tone was completely uncharacteristic of her. More significantly, though, there was something else that was truly remarkable. Katie never made mistakes like that, so the misspelling of the word while in both messages just didn't make sense. Then her son said another thing. He claimed to have received a message on social media from a man named Andrew. Katie dated Andrew for a number of years before they broke up. Katie checked herself into a clinic. He wrote in the message and asked him to watch her dog until she returned. Katie's mother and sisters found the entire situation somewhat odd. They had known for a long time that she was seeing Andy, but their relationship had never been easy. The two of them were always on and off. It didn't make much sense for Katie to tell him about her plans while keeping her own mother and children in the dark, given her family understood that they were no longer even together. Katie had also mentioned Andy in the messages she'd sent to her daughter and son. She claimed Andy would take over if their father was unable to care for them. After a while, one of Katie's sisters managed to obtain his number and called him. Andy informed her that he had been at work all morning and hadn't seen Katie since the previous day. Around 2 p.m., he claimed she texted him to let him know she was dropping off her car at his house and to leave her bank card and keys in his mailbox. Andy had previously assisted Katie in paying for anxiety medication, and she owed him a substantial amount of money, roughly £6,000. He therefore believed that this was her method of repaying him. Katie's subsequent message stated that she was returning to a clinic because she was unable to cope with the anxiety any longer. He didn't think much of it because Andy didn't say anything about it, which struck him as strange. Katie's sister, however, was not at all buying Andy's explanation. In order to find out for themselves, she and her boyfriend made the decision to drive over to his house. She saw Katie's car parked outside as soon as they arrived. She was even more suspicious because she could see Katie's purse and other personal items within. In an attempt to speak with him directly, she knocked on Andy's door, but he instructed them to go since he wouldn't open it. Everything about it seemed so strange. Katie's sister couldn't understand why Andy was acting so uncooperatively and why he didn't appear in the least bit concerned. Andy contacted the police instead of her boyfriend, who threatened to kick down the door if he didn't let them in. Officers showed up a few minutes later and started by talking to Katie's sister. She explained everything. The family was really concerned and didn't think for a moment that Katie would simply disappear without speaking to anyone. She also mentioned that her sister's belongings were still in her car, which was still parked there. The police then came to knock on Andy's door. He told them the same narrative he had told on the phone. Katie contacted him while he was at work, saying she was going to check herself into a clinic and that she had left her car, keys, and bank card. He even allowed them to check his van and house, but they found nothing unusual. After leaving, the police opened a case for a missing individual in the hopes that Katie had actually checked herself in somewhere. They called a number of clinics just to be safe, but none of them had seen her. Police started assembling a timeline of Katie's disappearance the following morning. And because her car had been located near Andy's house naturally, all eyes were on that location. Investigators discovered a security camera in the area. As a result, they extracted the video from the last 2 days. Katie was spotted arriving at Andy's house on April 21st, the day before she vanished. She was seen on camera laughing, kissing him, and climbing into his van. There seemed to be nothing unusual. However, by 9:20 a.m. the following day, things drastically changed. Although the video showed otherwise, Andy told police that day that he had been at work when Katie allegedly dropped off her car. It showed Katie pulling up to his house, getting out of her car, and climbing into Andy's van's passenger seat, and Andy himself was right there behind the wheel. Police looked at traffic cameras along the van's path right away and ultimately saw it again. This time, the vehicle pulled up to a McDonald's before continuing on its way to the freeway. In the last video, Andy could be seen turning into a wooded area on a rural back road. The van then vanished from sight for about an hour before reappearing and making its way back the direction it had come. But this time, the car was carrying just one individual. A much darker picture was now beginning to take shape. It appeared from the video that Andy had pushed Katie into a wooded area before taking off without her. Police retrieved location information from Katie's phone on the day she vanished after watching the CCTV footage. According to the record, her phone first disconnected from the tower close to her house that morning, before reconnecting close to Andy's residence. From then, the phone trajectory mirrored the van's identical course. However, things eventually stopped falling into place. Katie's phone was still in the van as it drove back to Andy's house based on the location data. The issue was that Katie had left the van. The last component then arrived. Investigators looked into when Katie's mother and children received those odd communications, and Andy was already home by himself by then. However, it was evident from location data that he sent those texts from his home. Police chose to return to Andy's home because all of the evidence directly refuted his account of what happened. And there was a strange feeling as soon as they entered. It was swelteringly hot. It turned out that even though the weather was very moderate, Andy had started the wood-burning stove. Detectives immediately thought that he was attempting to erase some evidence. However, by the time they arrived, the stove was empty except for ash. Nevertheless, they took Andy into custody and interrogated him. He didn't appear nervous at all, which surprised me. He actually appeared totally at ease and continued with his initial account, asserting that Katie had most likely checked herself into a clinic to manage her anxieties. He abruptly stopped talking and declared he wouldn't speak without a lawyer as investigators began to press for more information. Thus, once more, they had nothing left. Following the questioning, authorities made the decision to conduct a thorough search in the woodland where Katie's phone had last ringing just before Andy was spotted driving back by himself. However, it was not a simple effort to cover that region. They had around 25 miles of tough terrain in front of them. Nevertheless, they called in scores of officers, asked other agencies for assistance, and then went into the woods. They soon had drones, specialized equipment, helicopters equipped with thermal imaging, and even a group of divers. Volunteers also participated. It soon became one of the largest search efforts their community has ever seen. However, it was still insufficient to cover such a vast area with all that manpower. Then, unexpectedly, the cops received a tip. Andy's van had been spotted parked in a particular area of the forest. Everything altered as a result. They were able to focus their search to a 5 mm radius now that they had a plausible location. Detectives hauled Andy in for more interrogation while the search teams searched the woodland. They presented their collected evidence, including surveillance film this time. And now that he knew the truth, Andy's story was altered. He acknowledged that he had driven into the woods with Katie, but detectives were perplexed by what he stated next. Andy claims that they went there to enjoy a picnic together. He said that in order to let go of things that were bothering her, Katie would often write down her thoughts in a journal and then burn the pages. That morning had been the same, he insisted. He claims that he drove home after they had a picnic, built a little fire, and she burnt a few pages. He said he didn't know what happened to Katie after that. Detectives obviously didn't believe Andy's narrative, but the issue was that they still had no reliable leads. After the search teams failed to find Katie in the woods, investigators turned their attention to her relationship with Andy. Her family claims that Katie had already met him 3 years prior. He worked in construction, had 2 children from a previous marriage, and initially came across as a steady, dependable man. However, her loved ones quickly noticed the relationship's flaws. Andy had a tendency to try to dictate to Katie how she should behave, speak, and even think. Additionally, he used her worry as an excuse to minimize anything she said or did that he didn't like. And as time went on, that pressure just exacerbated her anxiousness. Katie eventually accepted Andy's offer to cover the cost of her care. However, things continued to deteriorate over time. The relationship finally collapsed as the arguments became more regular and heated. For Katie, ending the relationship was a relief. However, Andy simply couldn't come to terms with it. Shortly after their breakup, Katie found out that her car's tires had been cut. She never told the police, even though she was positive it was Andy. A few months before Katie's disappearance, she received a court document stating that she owed Andy £4,000, which was the sum he had paid for her medical care. Katie didn't know how she would find that type of money, and she was already having trouble paying for necessities for herself and her children. With the accumulation of late fees, the debt reached £6,000. She was quite anxious about the entire scenario. She feared losing her house and the only secure environment her children had. Above all else, though, she feared Andy. Katie expressed her fear of him and her sincere belief that he could harm her in a message to her mother. She even said to her sister, "Look at Andy first, if anything ever happens to me." Nevertheless, Andy contacted her a month before she vanished. He apologized to her for ever bringing her to court. In addition to promising to pay all the additional expenses that had accrued since the decision, he also pledged to withdraw the lawsuit. After Andy informed her he wanted to change and expressed regret for his rage, Katie finally forgave him. They reunited in spite of everything. However, investigators discovered something much more unsettling. Andy actually called the debt collectors and ordered them to be harsher on Katie just 1 day after he had pledged to make things right with the court. He desired for them to exert further pressure on her. All of this, according to investigators, was part of his scheme to put her under more stress and increase her reliance on him. Naturally, Andy maintained telling Katie that he was working on canceling the entire event. So Katie was unaware of this. He gave the debt collectors another call a few weeks later, this time saying that Katie had attacked him when she arrived at his place. He urged them once more to pursue her for the money as soon as possible. Katie panicked when they contacted her, but Andy dismissed her out of hand, telling her that she was exaggerating and that there was no need to panic. He noted that although it was difficult and would take time, he was still trying to have the court decision overturned. He immediately resumed telling her that something was wrong with her and that she needed help, just like he had done before. Detectives were presented with a more bleak image of their situation as a result. The evidence all pointed to the same conclusion. Andy was an expert manipulator and a chronic liar who would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. Detectives immediately received additional evidence to support that notion. The same was said by many who knew him. They informed investigators that Andy had a talent for manipulating people's thoughts, even those closest to him, and that he had been doing this for years. However, despite all, the cops were still unable to locate Katie. Day after day passed with no sign of her during the protracted search. At last, however, investigators got a break. One of the locals shared an odd story. He claimed that Andy appeared at his residence out of the blue the morning after Katie vanished. Andy approached him and asked him a strange question, even though they didn't know one another. "When was the last time your bins were emptied?" Red flags were raised at once. The trash cans outside hadn't been picked up in days when officers hurried over to investigate. They began searching through the trash and discovered something chilly inside one of the bags. Blood was on it. Katie's sandals were also inside. The blood was identified as hers by a DNA test. Detectives knew one thing at that point. Andy was formally charged with Katie's murder, and she was no longer there. However, one major issue remained. The whereabouts of her body remained unknown to them. Andy told detectives he wanted to speak shortly after he was officially charged with murder, and he rewrote his story once more as before. This time, Andy said that he had gone for a picnic with Katie in the woods that morning. Katie noticed a hatchet he had used to cut some wood while they were seated by the fire. He further claims that she made fun of him by daring him to toss it in an attempt to strike a Coke can. She was holding a few feet away. Andy claimed to have accepted her offer, but Katie abruptly leaned forward as he hurled the hatchet, causing it to strike her in the back of the head. Detectives didn't believe a word of it, of course. However, Andy at least acknowledged the location of her body this time. He claimed to have panicked when Katie passed away. In that area of the jungle there was no cell service. Furthermore, he claimed that he lacked the strength to bring her back to the van. In order to prevent animals from reaching her remains, he chose to bury her there. He claimed that after burying Katie's body in a small hole, he covered it with branches and leaves. He then tied a plastic bag on a stick to mark the location, intending to return later. Andy explained that his intention was to return home, bid his children farewell, make all the necessary arrangements, and then simply disappear. Along with some of Katie's other possessions, he also acknowledged setting fire to her phone in his fireplace. He then picked up the burned remnants and disposed of them in a garbage can somewhere in the city. Police returned to Andy's home after talking to him in the hopes of finding something fresh. This time, traces of blood that belonged to Katie were discovered inside his washing machine by forensic specialists. In the meantime, Katie's body was still being searched for. The stick Andy claimed to have used to mark the burial place with a plastic bag was the main target of investigators. However, the search crew was still unable to pinpoint the precise location. Despite that hint, detectives found something more while the search was still going on. They looked into Andy's online behavior and discovered that he had been flirting with almost anyone who would reply, chatting to several women on several dating sites. He had even been going out with at least one woman. Their talks revealed that Andy had informed her that he owned several residences throughout the nation. They even discussed purchasing a home and relocating to Scotland together. However, that wasn't even the most fascinating aspect. Investigators continued searching through his phone until they found something that completely altered the situation. According to GPS data, Andy had visited his parents' house the day before Katie disappeared and then switched off his phone for approximately an hour and a half. His van was shown traveling directly into the woods on multiple security cameras during that period. Police learned from speaking with Andy's parents that he had borrowed a shovel the morning before Katie vanished. Then it dawned on them. That day, Andy had most likely gone into the woods to prepare her tomb. After killing Katie and texting her children and relatives on her phone the following day, Andy used his own phone to text his other lover. He informed her that he would have to call off their date because of an issue with his children. That wasn't all, though. Investigators discovered something much more unsettling in his phone's notes app. Drafts of the exact same letters he had sent to Katie's mother and kids. According to digital forensics, he had been making several edits to those drafts over the course of several weeks in an effort to replicate Katie's writing style and allay suspicions. The fact that the word while was misspelled exactly as it was in the final communications was the most striking of all. It is also important to notice that the note was written more than a month before to the murder, which is unquestionably proof of one thing. Andy didn't lose his temper. He had been meticulously setting the foundation for something he knew he was going to do for weeks, if not longer. Andy said he had only gone to the woods to walk his dog, not to dig a grave. When police confronted him with the proof that he had been there the day before the murder, the stick with the plastic bag Andy had indicated was soon located by search teams, but no burial was uncovered in the area. They looked everywhere, inch by inch, but found nothing. Detectives therefore came to a conclusion. They wanted Andy to show them the precise location where he buried Katie after bringing him outside into the woods. When they arrived, Andy indicated a certain area on the ground. The fact that search teams had already visited that precise location several times without even considering the possibility that a grave might be concealed there astounded everyone. The ground appeared smooth, level, undisturbed, and entirely natural. Nothing out of place, no moved earth, no indications of digging. Officers later acknowledged that without Andy's assistance, they would never have discovered it because it had been so expertly hidden. The forensic team located Katie exactly where Andy had stated she would be as soon as they started their investigation. However, none anticipated what they discovered next. Andy had somehow buried her under a network of tree roots that were spreading well below the surface. A geology specialist later described the true complexity of that tomb. Digging something like that would have taken hours, he said, and he couldn't have completed it all at once. He would obviously return more than once. The expert also noted that the reason the tomb appeared so undisturbed was because Andy had sorted the soil into layers and then re-aerated them in the proper order. It was scary to see that amount of preparation. Following the recovery of Katie's body and its transfer to forensic experts, Andy's account of the Coke can and the axe throw immediately collapsed. Not just 1 or 2 hatchet blows to the head had killed Katie. She had received 12 blows. The detectives' heads were clear of doubt by then. This was no coincidence. This was a premeditated, cold-blooded murder. The prosecution then started getting ready for the trial. The overwhelming weight of the evidence against Andy was sufficient to have him convicted, but the motive was still a mystery. Investigators thought that hatred and animosity were what drove Andy. It seems like his ego was unable to cope with the rejection after Katie had ended their relationship months prior. They thought that he killed her because his wounded pride had turned into hatred. Andy first entered a not guilty plea before the trial started in November 2022, but after only 3 days, he abruptly veered off track. Suddenly, he changed his mind and confessed to the crime. He simply took responsibility without providing any other information, which was regrettably sufficient for Katie's family. The court ultimately deemed him a highly dangerous person and condemned him to life in prison with a chance of parole only after 32 years. Consequently, the matter was formally concluded. However, there are still unanswered issues about Andy's story. It's difficult to get rid of the thought that Katie might not have been the only one, especially because he was pursuing other women on dating apps and dating several people at once. Everything about him suggested that he was a man who enjoyed hurting and controlling the women in his life. Furthermore, there are all the indications that Katie may not have been the first. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, please like, comment, and subscribe. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep sharing these important stories.